I'm here to tell you, based on my ordeal and experience from the inside of the national security establishment, that much of what goes by the truth, much of what is passed off as the truth, is a lie. And when the truth attempts to prevail, the government recasts it as official narrative in a way in which it wants you to believe it's the truth. For you historians out there, what do you know about Operation Ajax? Operation Ajax. Interesting. I make my point. Operation Ajax was a CIA operation that overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. It cleaned out democracy under the Eisenhower administration, lest we forget history. Anybody remember what happened with the USS Vincennes in 1988?
It was Johns Hopkins University actually worked on the Aegis cruisers. So shut down an Iranian passenger airliner, killed something like 234 civilians.
The reason they shot it down is that the commanding officer of the USS Vincennes, it's a guided missile cruiser, thought that the Iranian Airbus Flight 655, which made a regular transit across the Gulf, was in fact an F-14 Tomcat. It was a mistake. But he was trigger happy, and tensions had been had been rising in that area for a while, and he was ticked off. Decided that, you know what, here's my chance. One of the most egregious murders that's ever taken place, one of the single greatest losses of life of a civilian airliner.
He got the Medal of Appreciation from Reagan.
So I just want to remind people that history matters. True history matters. And then when we forget the history of yesterday, we're probably, and I'm paraphrasing someone else, we're probably condemned to repeat it in the future, if not tomorrow. 5 days after 9/11, 2001, Vice President Cheney went on the national airwaves. And he said something very interesting on 16 September 2001, that we were going to be going to the dark side. And no one ever fully appreciated what that meant, except for some of us that were on the inside. As we saw with utter horror, 9/11 being used as an excuse to not only radicalize government, but to cast the Constitution aside and establish in a much, much stronger institutionalized ways the national security regime. I say that because what I saw unfold from the inside as a senior executive of the National Security Agency, including the run-up to the war in Iraq, including the extraordinary decisions that were made in the deepest corners of government to establish as official policy a torture regime that, as it turns out in a more recent report, involved at least 54 countries cooperating with the United States of America. A vast secret surveillance program that was instituted in the days and weeks after 9/11 that is now reaching into every corner of our society at a level that most people still do not fully appreciate. I was eyewitness to much of this. And for the few minutes that I have, I say this with some emotion. It's not the country I took an oath to support and defend 4 times in my government career. twice in the military, once in CIA, and then at the National Security Agency. I'm having a great difficulty recognizing the government of this country. It is clear that the Constitution has become a quaint document, in the words of John Yoo, one of the authors of many of these secret memos that were established during the Bush administration. And then seeing under the Obama administration, not just the continuance of the national security regime, but the furtherance of its institutionalization and normalization. As the title of my talk suggests, it really is the pathology of power. And the tails are wagging the dogs of war. And when it comes to Iran, any excuse, if possible, if the government gets away with it, can be used as a pretext for war. But here's the problem: when you speak truth to power, they don't like it. When you expose government wrongdoing and government conduct, it becomes a crime. When you actually practice the First Amendment, you are considered a traitor. Truth becomes treason in the empire of lies, lest we forget. I find it horrific. I find it extraordinarily disturbing and distressing. And I, too, utter the same words that Benjamin Franklin said when he was purportedly interviewed outside the building in which they had just created the Constitution and was going out to the 13 colonies for ratification in 1787, when she asked, "What did you guys create in there?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." Whatever notions we have about our history, and it's fraught with contradiction and lots of paradoxes, it was a grand experiment. And I have people who tell me that I'm a naive citizen, and we're America. And you have to understand, Tom, that whatever Americans do is in the right and best interest of history because we're America. So I have great concerns about the future, and I have extraordinary concerns about what happens when the government takes onto itself the kind of secret power that it now holds, and the ability that it has to project its own power as a compensating mechanism, not just on its own citizens, but in its pursuit and folly of foreign policy. This idea that you need enemies to justify your own existence is a disease. And so we're seeing an Orwellian space where we call those who we capture detainees, because if we actually said they were prisoners, they would have rights. We use euphemisms like enhanced interrogation techniques as a substitute to avoid the truth of torture. We call it Gitmo when in fact it's truly an illegal, extra-constitutional, offshore penal colony. It's actually just one of a number of them around the world. There are many black sites to this day we still don't know where they may be specifically located or to the extent to which we sent many, many people. We use kill lists as a means of clean torture because it's messy to actually take them off the battlefield, which it turns out the battlefield is now everywhere. This is what happens to an empire. Think about the crippling sanctions that the Iranian people are currently experiencing. Crippling sanctions as punishment. As punishment? All of this is American deceptionism, writ large. So don't believe any of the official narratives, because the official narratives are more often than not a prop. So it's important in a few minutes I have remaining, because for me the Q&A is far more valuable than anything that I might say. But I spent 5 years on the receiving end of what started out as a criminal, national security criminal investigation, ended up being indicted by the government because I spoke truth to power. I became an enemy of the state. I was betrayed by my own country. And although I sit here in front of you as a free man, the price that I paid and others have paid is extraordinarily high. We are seeing the radicalization of our own government. It is no longer rule of law. Secrecy rules in the halls of power. We have secret wars, we have secret evidence, and if the evidence doesn't fit, then we make it up. I saw that happen in my own case. It didn't matter what the truth was. In fact, that was the great concern that I had, that when I was indicted on 10 felony counts in April of 2010, after the government spent 2.5 years figuring out how they were going to indict me, well, guess what the first 5 charges were? Espionage. Espionage? Fear has become the governing force. Fear is the governing force that's now in season. And so, ends justifies the means when, if you abandon rule of law, if you abandon openness and transparency, which has now become deception and propaganda, we should not be surprised with the history that is made by our own government. In 2007, just to give you a sense of how this pretext occurs, and then project this out on the world stage. You have to remember that Bush himself said in his own memoirs that if it had not been for the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate on Iran, he would have gone to war with Iran. Lest we forget. In his second administration, he was itching to take them on. And he wasn't able to. Truth does matter. In November 2007, I was visited by a dozen FBI agents unceremoniously at my home, as well as a simultaneous raid on my office at the National Defense University, where I was teaching strategic leadership and information strategies. That's when my nightmare began, although I had been under intense investigation and surveillance, both physical and electronic, for the previous 18 months. Why? Why? It's important to understand truth really does matter, and the government was going to do everything it could to snuff it out. And the thing they wanted to do was ensure that at least one person was going to be made a scapegoat. Because I will tell you that just like John Kiriakou, who's sitting in a prison right now in Loretto, Pennsylvania, for having done what? He spoke the truth about torture. And yet none of the torturers are serving any time, nor have any of them been brought to justice. I'm the only person prosecuted and indicted for the secret surveillance program, the illegal secret surveillance program. I had nothing to do with that surveillance program. I was not the author of it. And in fact, I was the executive program manager on a program that not only would have provided superior intelligence to the United States intelligence establishment and national command authorities, up to and including the president, but would have absolutely protected the Fourth Amendment rights of U.S. persons. But that didn't matter. As I was told in the days and weeks after 9/11, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. We live in extraordinary times, and that requires us in secret to use extraordinary means. Think Machiavellian. Extraordinary means to deal with the threat. If that means abandoning the Fourth Amendment and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, so be it. And so the United States of America was turned into the equivalent of a foreign nation for the purposes of blanket, dragnet electronic surveillance. And the scale and the penetration of our own country now is extraordinary. It is a surveillance state. We've become a war economy. We've spent trillions to date, with more trillions in terms of the cost going forward. For what? This is not about planting seeds of democracy anywhere. We're raining down seeds of conflict everywhere. We have a military mercenary arm of the state to do its bidding. That's the reality of what we're looking at. But there was a point during my cooperative period with the government in which the chief prosecutor said, speaking of pretext, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake, unless you start cooperating with our investigation? You see an article had come out in the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, revealing for the first time publicly, written by James Risen and Eric Whistleblower, the United States had engaged in warrantless wiretapping in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And in fact, what had been revealed in the article was only the tip of the iceberg. It only dealt with the one small element, as it turns out, of a much larger surveillance program. They thought that I was the ringleader. They thought that I was the main perpetrator, and that I had engaged in a conspiracy with others against the United States of America, that I was causing exceptionally grave damage to the security of the United States of America. Nothing could be further from the truth. And yet, as I was told by a very well-placed source, Cheney had issued the order, find and fry. I don't care who it is, make an object lesson of it. As it turns out, under the Obama administration, it never happened under the Bush administration. This is the look backwards, not forwards mantra. They chose to punish me. I will not go into the details of what happened to me. Needless to say, I'm here speaking about it. I mention all of this. I remember the horror of discovering what was going on in Abu Ghraib. I remember whispered meetings in secret. Don't tell anybody, Tom, from JAG officers saying you don't know the extent to which we have all of these black sites and we have all of these people that we've pulled off, quote unquote, the battlefield, and what we're doing to them in secret. Horror of horrors. See, I went through the very training program that was designed to show us how to resist torture if we were ever captured when I was flying an RC-135s during the Cold War up at Fairchild Air Force Base. Never could I have imagined that they would take that program, the SEER program, in which I was, in training, waterboarded twice, in which I was exposed to all of the enhanced interrogation techniques, and then some. Sensory deprivation in a training environment. Never could I have imagined that that same program would be used as the basis and foundation for an official torture program supported by the highest levels of the government. That's what's happened in this country. See, I became a whistleblower. I cooperated 2 9/11 congressional investigations. I cooperated with the Department of Defense Office Inspector General. I lived with a lot of dirty knowledge, secret knowledge, that I exposed and disclosed. I ultimately did go to reporter in 2006 with what I knew. The government wanted to put me away for a very, very long time for speaking truth. So I'll share with you a couple of things and why I truly do fear for the future of the Republic, the tattered remains of the Republic. During the run-up to the Iraq, I say this as a pretext of what is already happening with respect to, although right now North Korea has become a bit of a diversion. I worked with very senior linguists at the National Security Agency. So here's a little piece of history that most people have never heard of. He was part of the briefing team. This is a briefing team that was providing Powell information regarding what was known with respect to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So think of the parallels with Iran and all the many attempts over the years to use as pretext justification. And so everything that was being shared with Powell from Tenet and company were lies, all fabricated lies, totally, all of it. That's just one small piece. He regrets to this day that he's sitting literally outside the room because he was considered an expert in that region, an expert. What could have been. In my case, I had the could have beens of what NSA knew, didn't share, chose to push under in terms of what it knew about 9/11. Information that had been shared properly could have actually prevented 9/11. Even the 9/11 Commission said they did not receive cooperation from the NSA. All of the evidence, material evidence that I provided to any number of investigations was either heavily redacted or is completely expunged as if that history never existed. During my own trial, pre-trial proceeding, the government filed formal motions to eliminate as admissible or relevant anything involving my whistleblowing history, including my cooperation in two 9/11 committees, investigations, anything involving the First Amendment, and anything involving classification. I wonder why. The government wanted to eliminate that history as irrelevant or admissible at trial in front of a public jury. I say all this because I really have true concerns about what else is the government doing in secret that we still don't know about. And so it's important for history and historians to understand that the secret side of U.S. history, in many cases, is far more relevant to the conduct of U.S. policy. And the irony and the paradox that we live in such this internet and digital age with staggering amounts of information, that what you're actually seeing here is a government's war on information. It wants to control it all as much as it can. And because it has the platform in which it can actually spew propaganda in a way that skews the truth and obscures what they're really doing. I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more that could be said. But it's extraordinarily sobering for me, and truth does matter. I will tell you, in the end, it mattered because in the end, I was saved by the First Amendment. I was saved in the court of public opinion. I had to have criminal defense attorneys. I was indigent. I had public offenders, but in the end, the truth did matter. And so, it is a disease. It's an extraordinary pathology. We have so many more. Just imagine the trillions that have been spent on war if those trillions were spent on plowshares. There's far more to who we are as human beings than simply trying to find enemies, creating artificial conflict because of this pathological need to project, which in itself is a compensating mechanism by those in power. And so I'll leave it at that, and we'll go to Q&A.
I think we should get straight into the questions. You put your hand up right away and then you
I assume there's nobody in the room from the Fourth Estate. I assume that. This is one of the most remarkable panel discussions I've ever heard. And I travel all over here, everybody. So I think what Ray is telling us, we all in this room have to be members of the Fifth Estate. We have to get this information out best we can. I happen to be in court, Tom, when you were being sentenced. And one of the things you left out was the government from an indigent client. Now, remember this, he was injured and he said the government still wanted $50,000 from him that day. And it was remarkable what Judge Bennett then said to those two prosecutors that particular day in Garment's Federal Courthouse. I urge everybody in the room to read James Bamford, Puzzle Palace, Body of Lies, Shadow Factory, 3 books about the NSA. The Pledge of Resistance, my anti-war group, is in book 2. And we knew, we've been protesting at the National Security Agency since July 4th, 1996. We knew they were spying on us. We knew that. It wasn't until a trial that through discovery, we actually got the documents. I happen to be one of the 53 people that were classified as terrorists, put into a terrorist database after the Joint Terrorism Task Force, including the NSA and the Maryland State Police, were spying on us, sending people into our meetings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very scary times, but I'm just so glad that you folks are doing what you're doing and speaking out. We all have to continue to speak out best we can.
What did the judge say? What did the judge say?
Tom would know it better than I, but Judge Bennett is a former public defender and a liberal, and excoriated. Maybe the best part of this for me, just me sitting in the courtroom watching this, was the two prosecutors were not the original prosecutors, so they were distancing themselves from what proceeded, as Tom said, in 2007. It was to me